tonight. My name is Esme Green. I'm the library director here, and I'm so glad to have Caitlin here and have this program tonight, and welcome to everyone. So to honor Sexual Assault Awareness Month, author Caitlin Avery is here with us tonight to talk about her new book, Life of Sin, and how it pertains to her own healing from the aggravated sexual assault she experienced in high school. Caitlin grew up in Sudbury and is a 1991 graduate of LS. She is an author with 3 published books and with the 4th in the works. She lives in Newton with her husband and son. Welcome, and I'm sure I've been hearing a lot of questions about what year people were, so I'm sure it's almost like a little bit of a reunion.
Yeah, so, big reunion.
It's really awesome, so welcome.
All right. So thank you to everyone who took time out of their busy schedule to come here, and I know some of you have actually already read the book, so I really appreciate all the support that I've been given since I published this book. So I know many of you have been sort of following the story along since 2015, but I definitely want to catch people up to speed. So the way that this started is in 2015, I outed my high school rapist on Facebook. And within 24 hours, I had learned of a total of 9 other victims. It happened very quickly. It was kind of like a brush fire that just caught and ran. And there were several things that happened immediately. It was like over the course of a couple of days. The first was that one of the other victims actually decided that she wanted to publicize her experience with the guy as well. She was also a writer, and she decided to publish a blog and a very detailed blog about what happened with her and this person. And that was just obviously hugely validating to me. All the other victims were very supportive and kind of excited about what I was doing, but no one else felt comfortable going public with their stories, which was totally fine with me. So basically, I came back on Facebook pretty quickly and said, oh, well, so now I found out that there's a whole bunch of other victims. Now, let me back up a little bit. The reason that I actually did this at that time, there were a couple of different reasons. I actually had known of 2 other victims for many years, okay? 2015 was 25 years after the assault happened. And in the early years after it happened, I learned of 2 other people. And I had been thinking for many, many years about what could be done about it. Obviously, it was way too late to call the authorities and report it to the police. But I just wondered if there were any sort of, any way that I could punish the guy. So basically, the reason that it happened in 2015 was that what set me off in particular was the Stanford rapist, okay? So that happened at that time. And just to fill people in, if you're not familiar with that case, it was a student at Stanford University. He actually was caught in the act of raping a woman who was completely blacked out, passed out behind a dumpster. There were witnesses who he ran, they chased him down. So there were witnesses, there was evidence. It looked like an open and shut case. And it was very exciting for me to watch this unfolding on the news, like somebody was really gonna finally pay their dues for this kind of crime. So in the end, he was found guilty, all right? And the judge during the sentencing phase said something to the effect of, I don't want to ruin this kid's life because of one mistake that he made, all right? So meanwhile, this young woman's story was all over nationwide news, and her life was virtually ruined for some time, I would say. So he ended up he was given 6 months in prison, and I guess because of good behavior, he was released after 3 months. And it was after he was released that I really started to get absolutely furious, because I just thought, well, if the law, even when things are perfect in terms of conviction, it's not working out to support women, so what are we supposed to do? What can we do? It's totally unreasonable. So again, I started sort of racking my brain about any kind of move I could make, and then I read a little article, I don't even remember where it was, but it was talking about how Lena Dunham, who was the creator of Girls, the show on HBO, she had recently outed her rapist on social media. And I thought, oh, that I could do. So it wasn't entirely spontaneous when I did it, but it happened pretty quickly, where just one evening I wrote a brief paragraph and threw it up on Facebook, and it was like the whole, like all of LS, everyone I knew from LS was like, what? And I immediately found out about all these other victims. Okay, so fast forward. Now, all these people are learning about this at the same time, and some people started talking about having a protest, either outside of his place of work in Boston or outside of his home in Wellesley. From what I understand, he's a very successful businessman, and so the idea was maybe just based on humiliation, like trying to have a protest. I wasn't quite sure what the end game was for that, but I figured that that would draw media attention potentially, and that kind of made me a little bit nervous. Because I hadn't set out to be like the poster girl for this. I was just really reaching out to my own Facebook community with this story. So then I was actually contacted by Michael Rosenfield, who is now an NBC reporter, but he was with NECN at the time. And he learned about the story through the grapevine, I guess, and contacted me for an interview. And I said, hold on a minute, I got to think about this. It was setting me into a bit of a panic. I didn't know what I was, like what kind of legal, what I was opening myself up to legally, and I was afraid I was going to get in trouble, right? So at the same time, somebody from LS, who was a lawyer, also reached out to me. It was a guy, and he said, you know, essentially, I support what you're doing. I think it's really fantastic, and I do know a lot about the law in regards to libel, so if you want some information, I'm happy to tell you, answer any questions that you have. So I immediately contacted him, and basically what he told me was it would be very unlikely that I could be sued for libel because it was the truth. But what he did say is that if I kept going after this guy with a protest and whatnot, at some point he would have to respond. It would be kind of pushing him up against the wall. And this lawyer said, you know, the response could be something like a cease and desist letter. But whatever it is, if you keep pushing, you're going to draw him into your life, right? You're going to have to deal with him at some point. And that made my hair stand on end. I was like not in for that at all. In fact, I had spent many years being concerned that I could run into him at some point. I had been living in Los Angeles for a long time, and I moved back to the area in 2010. And after I moved back was when I really started thinking, this is the one thing I was worried about coming back here. Was actually running into him at a gathering or a bar or something. And it wasn't that I was afraid I was going to kowtow and like panic. I was afraid I was going to be out of control and like, you know, scratch his eyes out or something. Like I just didn't trust that I would be, I don't know, publicly proper or whatever if I ran into him in public. So, when the lawyer told me that basically what I was doing would potentially bring him into my life, I said, whoa, that is definitely not what I'm looking for right now. And you have to understand that behind the scenes, I was getting commentary, or you know, people were contacting me in private messages and telling me like totally horrendous stories, not just about him. Like I heard from all these victims of him, but I also heard from other people who had experienced sexual assault, and they were giving me their details, and it was just a huge amount of like horror to absorb. And I had to absorb it quietly and by myself because it was totally not appropriate to share any of the details with anybody. Maybe if I'd had a shrink, I could have talked to them about it, but like there was just no one I could tell. So here I was just like collecting this information that I hadn't asked for, and I was 100% willing. I felt like I really needed to be an ear for these people. Some of them were telling me that they had never told anyone that they had been assaulted, and I was the first, and it was very overwhelming. So essentially, when I started thinking that I could potentially bring him into my life, and then I started getting paranoid that, well, what if he just shows up on my front stoop someday? Like, this is an actual potential. People had let me know where he was living, so I was getting all this information about him, and I thought, well, if I can figure out where he lives, he can certainly figure out where I live. And so I started carrying a bat in my car. I was driving around, going to work, going to the grocery store with a bat in my car, just in case, just in case I had to defend myself and whack him in the head with a bat. And that was not a healthy place to be. And I ultimately had a panic attack that sent me to the emergency room. It was just too much. So what happened, and let me say that this all happened in the course of a few days. It was maybe like 5 days, okay, all this stuff happened. So I came back to the people who were sort of talking about organizing a protest, and I said, I don't want to do that. And then I told the reporter, you know what, I'm worried about what I could be exposed to in terms of legality, so I'm just not ready for this. This was a year and a half before the Me Too movement began. So I had never seen anyone else do this, and I just had no idea what I was up against. So I essentially came back on Facebook, and I gave a little statement basically saying, I managed to do what I came here to do, and that's it. I'm going to shut the conversation down. I didn't speak about it again publicly, but I was speaking about it constantly behind the scenes. One thing that happened is when I outed him, I used his initials, and that was because I was afraid. I wasn't sure if that was going to be completely outrageous to say his name. As it turns out, you're really not supposed to do that. Like, you're not supposed to bully people and accuse people of crimes without proof and stuff. Not sure I completely believe in that in this situation, and that's why I have now not been following those rules. But at the time, because I put out his initials, there was one instance where someone came to me privately in my messages and had the wrong person with the same initials. And I said, oh my goodness, no, it wasn't them. And please, I came back and said, anybody who needs to know exactly who this is, I will tell anyone their name. I just can't say it publicly. So I did start sharing his name. I had been doing it for years already in private conversations, but I was sort of saying, come to me and I will tell you who this is, okay? So the bottom line is I shut the conversation down, and for, I don't know, it seemed like for many weeks afterwards, I was still receiving these stories, and sort of, my PTSD was acting up. It was definitely getting me emotional, and it was hard to handle. So then, fast forward a year and a half, the Me Too movement started, right? And on the one hand, I was kind of torn, because on the one hand, I was excited that now all these women on Twitter were basically sharing their own stories and being truthful and sharing facts about, their assaults online. And I thought it was wonderful, and I read a lot of the stories. Again, I felt like these people deserved attention and they deserved to be heard. So I was one of the people who was reading a lot of them. And again, that was difficult for me to deal with. So it set me into a bit of a tizzy, and I started to get really angry about the fact that even though these people were basically talking about their assaults blatantly online, nothing at all was being done about the people who had assaulted them. We were all basically just getting it off our chest and feeling maybe courageous as a result. But the end result was that the people who'd committed the crimes were still able to get away with what they had done and maybe continue doing it. And that was one of my biggest fears about the guy who assaulted me, is that, it happened to so many people in high school. And the people that I knew about, it happened, I was class of 91. It happened to people in the class of 90, 91, and 92. Those were the people that I heard about. All right, so I didn't even hear about people from his class, and I assumed there must have been people in that class. I could only imagine what happened at college with him, right? I just assumed that it was an ongoing situation. And I had a little bit of guilt over that, because with some of these situations, I knew that they happened after me. And I wondered if I had at the time gone after him with the law, if maybe that could have been prevented. So I definitely had a little bit of guilt. So anyway, the Me Too movement set me off to some degree, and I was like, what can we do about this, aside from just talking about it online? Well, for me, all my life, I've used writing to basically deal with big emotions and get everything down on paper so I can get it out of my head. So I started thinking about a story, and I ended up coming up with an idea to write a story about a woman who goes after her rapist 20 years after the fact and manages to do everything that I wish we could have done 2 hours. And I say we, like the collective we, right? I wrote it with victims in mind, or I should say survivors in mind. I definitely wanted to write a story that people could kind of cheer for. And I realized also that it was something of a fantasy, okay? Because what happens in Life of Sin is very unlikely to happen legally in real life. But Life of Sin has a couple of different messages. When I really started taking a look at other things that I could do to deal with my situation, I realized that really the only thing I had control over was myself. And a big theme of Life of Sin is that when it comes to trauma and conflict, you really got to clean up your own side of the street, right? You got to take a look at what you're dealing with as a result of this trauma and conflict and try to get it fixed. Because it's not okay to ruin other people's lives because you have been hurt. It's just not acceptable. So anyway, that's sort of what started the concept of Life of Sin. And I guess people who have read it have definitely, they're curious about what parts of the book are based on reality. I always say that it's a made-up story. It is a fictional story. Many of the characters are inspired by real people. So for instance, Sin there are parts of Sin that are like me, but she actually represents 3 different people I know. So me and 2 others. The character Sue in the very beginning of Life of Sin, who is one of Sin's friends, who was also assaulted by the same guy, is representational of this woman, Nicole Winborn. So people who went to LS may know the name. She is the victim who came out and published the blog about her experience with him. And so in the story, Sue is sort of representational of Nicole, who stood beside me during that experience. There are a couple other things that ring true. Oh, the big theme, obviously, in the story, Sin is dealing with early sobriety, and it is really dictating a lot of her behaviors. She's pretty messed up in the beginning, and she's definitely not thinking super clearly, and that is kind of why, in the beginning of the story, she sets out on a path of revenge that may or may not involve violence. So that is part of my story in the sense that I actually got sober in 1991, and it was a year almost to the date after I got assaulted. Now, I definitely don't believe that because I was raped, I became an alcoholic. That's not it at all. It is a correlation, okay? It's not causation. There is a correlation in that, I was basically going through high school and going to parties and drinking like the other kids, and then I got assaulted. And I could not handle what I was going through not entirely privately. There were people who knew about it. But as a result, I definitely went with my drinking. And it was like blackout drinking all the time. I was drinking many times throughout the week. Meanwhile, some of you know me from high school. I was also like a triple letterman. I was the captain of a couple sports. I started in a school play. Like I was, I had my stuff together for the most part, but behind the scenes, I was a mess. I was like drinking too much and too often, and it was ugly. So the bottom line is I had to quit drinking before I even went to college. The summer before college, I actually stopped. That was the first time I quit drinking. So I today have about 8.5 years of sobriety, and that is another sort of message that I'm trying to share in the book is that alcoholism is an insidious disease, and it's very difficult. It's hard to quit, but in some ways it's even harder to stay quit. All right, so I did not stay quit. I basically made it all the way through college. I made it through my 21st birthday, and sometime after that, I started to think, well, maybe it was just an immaturity issue, and I started drinking again. Now that time around, I was controlling it a lot more. I realized that I had taken it too far when I was in high school. I didn't want to have to quit again, so I was focused more on controlling it. I was focused more on not getting in trouble, not crossing a line that would get me to the point where I would have to quit again. So anyway, the theme in Life of Sin is that Sin is a bit of a mess, and she's drinking, similarly to the way I did, as sort of a self-medication, all right? She's basically trying to manage her life by, numbing out to some degree. And when she takes that out of the equation and the numbness goes away, that's when she gets really, like enraged. So that's another big commonality between my life and Sin's. And then people are curious about her husband. So in the story, Nick has in the past had an anger management problem. He got it sort of fixed. he decided to work on himself as a young man and got past that struggle. And then when he marries Sin, he sort of leads by example in regards to her understanding that she can also fix her own problems. You know, big, ugly problems, you can get through them and you can get past them and become a better person. So he influences her in that regard. Now, my husband is a little different. He actually was sober when we met. And I will say the very first night when I met him, I was back out drinking again. And almost immediately he told me that he didn't drink. And I thought, that could be really good for me. So needless to say, we wound up getting married, and eventually it came to the point where it was no longer working for me the way I was drinking, and I had to quit again. So my husband definitely was a big influence in my ability to quit again, and so that's the tie-in in terms of Nick and Sin in the book. So I guess one of the juicier tales that I have that is based on real story is in the story, there's a villain that comes in about halfway through the story, and he's referred to as the L3. L3 means L3 sex offender, and that translates as likely to offend again. So there is a real term, L3 sex offender, and that means that they are very likely to offend again. So when I was living in Arlington after we moved back from Los Angeles, and the Me Too movement was in full swing, I got an email one day from the Arlington police, I think it was the police, who said, we just need to notify you that there is an L3 sex offender who is getting out of prison and he's going to be moving back to your neighborhood. And he's allowed to do this, like he has served his time. He's, got to live his life. So you got to leave him alone. But we just need to warn everyone in the neighborhood that he's an L3, and that means that he's likely to offend again. And it just so happened that he moved in across the street from us. So I was sort of in this mental space thinking that like rapists were everywhere, and Me Too was like the whole world was like talking about assault, and all these people on TV were getting arrested, like the big names, Matt Lauer, all these guys were getting in trouble. And I was just like, oh my goodness, this is insane. So what happened was he was the nephew of our landlord. Our landlord lived upstairs. He lived across the street. He used to come into her house when she wasn't home. I don't know what he would do there, but he would come in, and technically he had access to our apartment via the basement if he had so chosen to come into our apartment. So I had locks installed on the inside of our doors so that even if you had a key to get in from the outside, you couldn't get in if the door was locked. I was living like this. So many of the things that Sin deals with in the story that happen between her and this L3 sex offender, they are things that I thought could happen. They definitely did not happen in my real life, but I had a very active imagination at that time, and so much so that I actually had a baton in my bedroom, in my nightstand that I slept with just in case that guy came in to the house at some point. So there was definitely a lot of PTSD, over, emotional thinking, and just, I was scared of him. And as a result, I never actually made eye contact with him, and I never said a word to him. So technically, I never had any kind of trouble with him. I didn't have any run-ins of any sort. He did sort of he gave off a vibe that he was kind of pissed off that we wouldn't interact with him or look at him, but that was pretty much it. But 2 weeks after we left Arlington and moved into our new house in Newton, he actually tried to murder his girlfriend in her sleep by strangulation. He was pretty quickly arrested and sent back to prison on the 3 strikes law, so I don't know when or if he'll be getting out ever. So anyway, that was definitely a big part of my life that really wasn't that dramatic for me, but in my head it got very dramatic at times. So those are all the similarities between my story and Life of Sin. And basically, I just kind of want to explain why I'm doing all these author talks now. I mean, obviously, I'm trying to sell books. That's clear, right? It's a marketing thing. But more importantly is that because I've been talking about this openly and repeatedly for so many years, the miracle is that I have no emotional response to it anymore. I may as well be just discussing my grocery list right now. There's no nervousness. I don't get angry. I'm not angry at him. There's nothing. It's become just, it's just the facts. It's no big deal to me anymore. And that's pretty miraculous. And I really do attribute it just to the fact that I opened my mouth and started talking. So I try to lead by example, especially online. I do a lot of reels on TikTok and Instagram, trying to just say, like, we can talk about this. I'm trying as much as I can to end the secretive nature of sex assault, all right? I don't blame anybody for keeping their assault a secret, but it is true that when it's a secret and these guys who do these crimes realize that, they know there's a much bigger chance that they're gonna get away with it if people are afraid to talk, right? So I'm done with the secrecy. Like, the biggest thing for me is that I want to make it clear that, number one, I have not gotten in trouble for doing this. I have not gotten in any trouble. Nothing has happened to me that's bad as a result of my talking so openly. And instead, there's been too many good things to count. I literally cannot tell you the amount of support and it's just amazing, like the connection that I've made with people when strangers will contact me on Facebook in my private messages and share details and stories of their own assault. And by the way, this time around, I was prepared for it. Because of last time in 2015 that happened, I was completely aware that it was going to happen again, and this time I've embraced it. And I'm again, very comfortable talking to other people, strangers, whatever, about their assaults, about my assault. It doesn't bother me. So that's one thing I'm trying to impart upon women. And then the thing I'm trying to impart upon parents is that I am the parent of a teenage boy. And we have been talking about the concept of consent for a very long time. There was a pretty interesting situation that happened when I was taking my son to, I think it was his 5th grade birthday party, and we had a car full of boys. And on the way, they were egging him on and teasing him about a crush that he had. And it turned into a conversation where they were pushing him and egging him on to like kiss the girl before the school year ended. They wanted her, like they were saying, get like on the playground, just grab her, just chase her, get her, that kind of like vibe. It wasn't the exact language. But when they started talking like that, and it was like 4 boys kind of like all together saying, you can do it, dude, just do it. I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. This is not how we kiss girls, okay? The most important thing you guys have to be, the thing you have to understand is that you have to ask. And I'm not telling you that you're not allowed to kiss girls. That's fine. If the girl says yes, if she's into it, by all means, have fun. But you have to find out if she's into it first, all right? So how do we do that? It's not that complicated. Regardless of what the situation is or the age of the people that we're talking about, the people who are proposing that something happens need to get a clear-cut yes. There has been a move in, recent years that, talking about no means no. But that's not good enough, because that insinuates that if you don't get a no, then it's okay, right? Well, that doesn't work for a girl who's passed out, for instance. So my idea is that we need to get a clear-cut yes. We need to teach our kids, so maybe the girls we need to teach that you have to clearly say yes, or say I am into this is all good, if things are going to happen. And the boy has to wait for that to happen. And it could happen vice versa, but when I've talked about this online, I've actually had grown adults say something like, that sounds so dorky. Like, I can't imagine having to say that before I got with somebody. It just sounds too, lame. And I think to myself, okay, maybe it's a little bit awkward, and maybe it'll take a little bit of practice to get past the awkwardness. But let's face it, kids who are fooling around for the first time, it's awkward no matter what. There's a lot of awkward situation. Even adults, right? First time getting together with somebody, it's a little awkward. So it's a little bit better to deal with the awkwardness than to deal with decades of trauma, okay? I can attest to that. It's totally worth dealing with the awkwardness. And as parents, trying to figure out what the language is that we can teach our kids that is, not too uncool, but it gets the yes that we all need. So that's sort of what the message that I've been trying to spread in my discussions as I talk about my book. And I think basically that's all I have to say about my book and my experience, but I do have a couple of screenshots that I wanted to share with you guys. Some of these have never been seen by anybody before, at least one of them. But so the first picture here This is my junior year yearbook shot, okay, just to give you an idea of how old I was and what I looked like at the time that I was assaulted. And this next one here is, this is the actual original post. So I'll give you guys a second to look at this. And it was only up for a few days. I don't have the date on here, unfortunately, but based on another screenshot that I'm going to show, it was sometime in June. It was early June when I did this. And I took it down. I'm guessing that it was about 3 days after I put it up that I took it down. Again, it was based in fear because I was afraid, I was worried that I was going to get in trouble. So you can see here at the bottom that the initials are KG, and that's what led to that one misunderstanding about who it was. So moving forward, I have generally been very open about who it is. And especially, I will say that I don't actually say his name when I'm like on TikTok or Instagram, because I don't see the point in that. I'm not trying to get like strangers to like email him or go after him or bully him online. That's not at all helpful. That's not going to do anything. What my point is I want to warn the community about him, right? Because there are people in this area who might come across him at some point. So I have openly told people that his name is Keith Gertler on many occasions. So if anybody wasn't sure who I'm talking about, that's just to be clear. So here's another shot that I'm going to share. So Keith actually reached out to me in 2012, so 3 years before I outed him. He friended me on Facebook. Okay, so I blocked him after he friended me, but before I blocked him, I sent him this note. And it's funny because I only stumbled across this recently, and there's a reference to a book, right? This is not Life of Sin that I'm talking about. 2 years before this, I had published my memoir. And my memoir is not about my assault. It's about my search for love and enlightenment, basically. But there is a chapter that details what happened to me. The details of Sin's assault are not the same as mine, but mine are definitely clearly laid out in my memoir. And so that's the book that I'm referring to. It was not a bestseller, just so you guys know. But, you know, that felt like the appropriate thing to say to him at the time. So anyway, and just so you know, I had never heard from him. I'd never spoken to him before my assault happened. This was not a date rape. And when I say I didn't speak to him, I did not speak to him that night at all. I was preyed upon and I was cornered. And the only time that I started talking to him was when I was trying to fight him off verbally and physically. And there was no discussion. I didn't have a flirtation with him, nada. That's why I refer to it as aggravated assault. It was also statutory because he was home from college for the summer. And I was in high school. I was 17. So it was a statutory situation. So the next slide. Oh, and he did contact me. This is a little interesting. He contacted me the following week to ask me out. Yeah, to ask me out. I did give him a piece of my mind at that time. But again, I was very young. And it's like I didn't really know what to do. In my 17-year-old language, I basically told him to screw off, and that was the end of that. But those are the only things I've ever talked to him about. That's the only interactions I've ever had with him. He's never contacted me since I outed him, and it's kind of interesting to note that he has never denied what happened. I have never heard any public statement from him that said he didn't do it. So that's kind of interesting. Anyway, here's another screenshot. This is the title of the blog that Nicole wrote. Her blog, and you can look it up today, it's still up there, is called The Working Mommy's Manual, and the title of it is here. And she actually tagged me when she published it. That's my original post at the top. She was referencing that post as her inspiration for writing the blog. So you guys can look that up if you are so inclined. It's a horrendous story. I can actually give you a little rundown because her story is the only one that I've ever been able to share publicly because she shared it. So it's public information. She was 16 at the time. She was at a party with Keith, and when she got home later that night, she was in her own bed, in her bedroom. He scaled a tree outside of her bedroom, came in through a window, and assaulted her in her own bed. So that's the type of assaults that we're talking about. She was dating one of his close friends at the time too, so that was kind of awkward. So this is the update that I gave on Facebook. It's pretty clear. After I started hearing about more victims, this is kind of like what inspired the absolute fury, where people said, let's have a protest, let's do something to go after him. This was sort of the impetus for that. And I don't want to rush through these too much. But the next one is the final post that I made when I shut the conversation down publicly. This was me sort of saying, I don't want to continue on with this, but essentially what I had come here to do was, when I outed him, I had 3 goals in mind. I wanted to shame him. Like, clearly I wanted to, tell people so that he would look like a horrible person. But I also, because I knew of 2 other victims, I wanted to validate the other victims. And then, of course, it ended up being many more victims. By the way, this time around, I have learned of more victims of him. One of whom, and I have to be careful, I'm very careful to not divulge information where anyone could guess what I'm talking about, but I will say that one victim was 10 years younger than him. And it happened a long, long, long time ago. So I don't know exactly what her age was, but it was, yeah. And this is a story that I just heard in the last 2 months or so. So here, the last slide that I have is my favorite list of rape prevention tips that I've ever seen. So many of the tips are based on telling women what we need to do differently. And it's not working. Like, women have been raped for thousands of years. Like, it doesn't matter if you're wearing a culotte or a pair of short shorts. It doesn't matter if you're drinking or not. I tell women all the time, like, if you're extremely drunk and naked walking down the street and you're not crossing paths with a rapist, you won't get raped. There's only one condition where you're going to actually be in trouble, and that's if you cross paths with the rapist in that situation. So I'm sick of hearing about how women shouldn't run with earphones on at night, and they shouldn't wear short dresses or whatever it is, inviting guys to come after them. So here is my favorite list of rape prevention tips. Obviously, the point being that it's on the guys. And I shouldn't keep saying just men and women all the time. Men also suffer from sexual assault. And in some cases, there are situations where men have been raped by women. There's certainly lots of situations where molestations happen to men. So women are not the only victims of sex assault, and I don't want to make it sound like that's what I'm saying. But my point is that we've been trying for years to do things differently, to keep changing our behaviors so that we can prevent this from happening. When I was a kid, the general sense the message that I got as a young woman coming into maturity was, don't get taken advantage of. That's sort of the message that I got, whatever that means, right? That sounds like a really gentle way to describe rape, actually, because that is not at all what happened to me. It wasn't about getting taken advantage of. I was cornered and preyed upon, and for at least 10 years after that, I felt like prey. It really influenced my life in many ways. I took up kickboxing for many years because I felt like, as a young woman, I was basically walking down the street, I could be, basically assaulted or attacked or whatever. And that was solely because of my experience. I don't think I would have had that mindset otherwise. So anyway, that's the main point of the rape prevention tips. Let's stop telling women what to do differently and start talking to the guys instead. And then the last shot that I have is, this is just a picture of me at 17. I was a kid, right? And I grew up real fast. I had to grow up real fast after my assault. And sometimes I wonder how my life would have gone differently if I hadn't dealt with that, and then subsequently become an alcoholic, and like all the troubles that I had to deal with early on. But the bottom line is, every single thing that I've gone through in my life has gotten me right here, right now, and this is an awesome place to be. Like, it's okay. Everything that I've dealt with is totally fine. I don't have any regrets because whatever. I feel like I'm in a wonderful place, and even with this topic itself, I feel completely healed. I was not completely healed when I sat down to write the story, but in fact, the way that sin comes like full circle and finally gets through her trauma was a lesson to me. In sort of researching what she would need to do to heal completely, I learned there were things that I had not done that I needed to do. And one of those big things, and it might actually make people a little uncomfortable, but I actually have forgiven him. And I was able to forgive him because I actually came across some information that described forgiveness is simply letting go of anger. And so that seemed like a good idea to me. I am not angry about it. I'm not trying to ruin his life. I don't hope that he dies. I got word, people periodically fill me in on what's going on with him. And over the holidays, when I was kind of hitting this pretty heavy because my book was coming out, I got word from a few people who were completely supportive of me, but they just wanted to let me know that he was not doing well mentally at all. And friends of his were concerned that he might commit suicide. And so I backed off. I legitimately stopped talking about him for a few weeks because I was not trying to push him to kill himself. In fact, the only thing that could possibly happen moving forward that would make me feel remotely good about him is if somehow he were to come around, admit, his guilt, and somehow try to make amends for it. That's the only thing that I could ever imagine him doing that would actually be a good thing. Him killing himself, that's not going to solve anything. It's only going to hurt the people who love him. So I am not hoping for that. Now, when I was in my 20s, I definitely was hoping for that. I had a lot of discussions with Carrie here in the front row was a roommate of mine out in Los Angeles for a time. And because she knew about another person who had been assaulted by him, we had a lot of conversations about what we could do. It went so far as wondering if we could talk to some of the tough guys in Sudbury and have him beat up. There was never an idea of we were going to put a hit on him, but that wasn't even remotely possible. But we definitely thought, well, maybe we can have him injured somehow, right? But what would that have done? That wasn't going to take away my pain. I had to work on myself and get through all my stuff to take away my pain. It was me who took away my pain. So, I don't know. I think that's pretty much all I have in terms of my talk tonight. And again, I just want to thank everyone for being here and taking time out of your busy schedule. And yeah, that's it. That's all I got. No, in fact, in 2015, I heard from one of his best friends, the tone of the conversation was apologetic. The guy basically indicated that they sort of knew that his behavior was questionable back then, that kind of talk, and he was very sorry. And the last that I heard from that guy was that they were going to talk to him about his drinking. So a couple things I know about him is that since high school, he's been arrested a couple times. One was for DUI, and this is just public information. The other happened just a couple years ago where he was arrested for stealing a boat. So I have no idea what that's about. But, he does not have his stuff together. He needs to work on himself and get his stuff together because he is kind of a menace to society as far as I can tell. Well, that's what his friends indicated. That's sort of what was, yeah, they were saying that.
There's so many people. Why was he never caught? Why was he never caught or held accountable?
No one ever reported him to the police, from what I know. In fact, and I have to be really careful how I describe some of the other situations, but I will say that one person was 14 when she was assaulted, and she did tell her mother, and her mother let her stay home from school for a week. And I don't know why the mom didn't do it. I don't know why the mom didn't report him to the police. Speaking of mothers, like when my mom found out about it many years later, right? I did not tell my parents. I did tell my boyfriend at the time, my best friend at the time, and a coworker, because the day after, and I told them the day after it happened, I was at work and I couldn't pull myself together. I was crying in the bathroom. The coworker wanted to know what was the matter with me, and so I divulged what had happened. So I told 3 people right from the get-go. But when I told my mother, essentially when I was about to publish my memoir and I needed to let the bag out, the cat out of the bag on some things, she was a very outspoken woman. She was a big member of NOW and marched on Washington for women's rights all the time. And her first thing was, I want to call the Sudbury Town Crier. I want to put this in the paper. And at that time, I was not ready for that. I said, no, I don't want that. That's just going to be humiliating for me. Like, no, please, no. My mom is no longer with us, and I just wish she could see what I'm doing today, because she would have been so happy with the results, and it's really what she wanted. She wanted to publicize the situation, and I wasn't ready at that time. It's a personality disorder. I mean, the question is, why did he think it was okay what he did? I have no idea why somebody does that repeatedly and thinks it's okay. I have wondered, and I have absolutely no evidence of this whatsoever, but I have wondered, and this could be opening up a whole other can of worms, if there was potentially a list that he was trying to create, like get the most number of whatever's conquests. There's also, I've been suspicious as to whether or not there was a group of them, him and some other friends, who were possibly trying to, collect, I don't know, these situations, like compete with one another, see how many girls they could get. And maybe the only way they could get lots of them was to steal them, essentially, not with permission. So I looked it up at the time, and the statute of limitations was 15 years at that time, and at that point we were at 25 years. Now, I've heard since that the statute of limitations on sex assault it might have been nationally demolished, like it's no longer a thing.
State by state.
It's state by state? Okay, thank you. The lawyer in the front here. This is my friend Richard. So yeah, it never even occurred to me at that stage of the game. What did I have? I had no evidence. It was literally my word against his. Obviously, I had a bunch of other women who were saying the same thing, but they weren't willing to come forward. So, and you can see how many women it took with Cosby. What did they get up to 100? It was insane, right? So I had 10, and I've since learned of a couple more, but it just didn't even seem like there was any point to that whatsoever. So yeah. And by the way, anybody has any question, in case you haven't figured it out, I'm an open book, so you do not have to hesitate. But I will say, if anybody has a question that they're not quite comfortable asking in front of the audience, you can email me. And my email is caitlin@caitlinavery.com. Any question anybody has or comment, feel free. It's fine. Well, actually, to be clear, the people who contacted me to say that he might be suicidal, they weren't actually concerned about his welfare at all. They were concerned that what I was doing might be construed as causing his suicide. They said, you might want to just be aware, because if he kills himself right now and you're going after him like this, it might get a little tricky. And I agreed with him. I was like, I don't want to be blamed for that. It's not my fault. I certainly am not going to take the blame for that.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
That's a very different orientation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I certainly can't speak for others. I have no idea why people who know my story are still friends with him. I recently did finally unfriend somebody who, for that exact reason. It wasn't just that, it's that he's friends with him, and this guy has also just continuously sort of behaved in ways that indicate he's a supporter of that type of person, right? So enough things I saw online, I just said, I didn't block him, I just unfriended him, quietly, whatever. I was contacted by somebody else, though, recently, who wanted to tell me that it was a woman of somebody who, the wife of somebody who went to LS, and she wanted me to know that guy had unfriended my assailant in 2015 as soon as he heard, but he actually unfriended somebody, or broke off a real friendship with a long-term friend, And the reason for it was that this guy was still friends with the rapist. So he told his very long-term friend, I just can't be friends with you anymore because you're friends with that person. Yeah, so occasionally that happens. But I can't speak to why other people, welcome that kind of person in their life. Who knows? I have a lot of hope, but that tends to be my personality, right? I do believe evolution is slow, and I do believe that we're moving in the right direction. And I mean, a big thing is that the Me Too movement did indicate that guys could finally get in trouble. They weren't really getting in that much trouble legally, but obviously you don't want your name splashed all over social media either, being like a rapist, right? That's not good for people. So hopefully it'll start to be more like hopefully guys will be a lot more concerned about I want to make sure that I'm doing things by the book, so to speak, right? I don't want to cross the line and get myself in trouble. I tell people all the time that we don't have to worry that people will stop having sex because the guys are so nervous that they're going to get in trouble. No. Human beings will continue to get it on. It's just a matter of trying to figure out what kind of language we need to share together to make sure everyone is on board for whatever it is, all the different things, right, as we get more advanced in our getting together. We just have to make sure that girls and boys are comfortable with the concept of talking, right, not just kind of guessworking. I think that'll overall be a much better way to go about things, right? All the way from you don't have to guess if somebody, I don't know, if it just becomes more talked about, I think it'd be good for sexuality across the board. And I am hopeful, and I do know that they are teaching consent more, like parents are, and I think in school they're talking about it. So hopefully, and I will say, there was a time where I was sort of having this feeling that rape was everywhere and rapists were all around us, but that's not what I believe anymore. I think that there are a small percentage of rapists in our society, but the problem is they're repeat offenders, right? So you can imagine over the course of a lifetime how many times somebody can have sex with somebody. Well, that could represent however many rapes can happen, and it could be 100 different women. Right? I mean, obviously we're talking about that now. It's I don't think that LS was full of rapists. I think that we had one rapist that I know of that got around a lot, and that's a problem. So hopefully, people and there's always going to be criminals in the world, right? We can't end crime, period. But it's kind of interesting because when I was trying to get this book published, I ended up self-publishing, and that's because I had actually I looked for an agent for a year and a half. I submitted to 250 agents or something, trying to get this book published by a traditional publisher. And the message that I got over time, it kind of took some time to interpret it, but the message was this, that the Me Too movement was dead in publishing. All right, so I was submitting in 2020, and Me Too was in 2017. And of course, after Me Too, a whole bunch of movies and books and TV shows started focusing on that, and they were tired of it by the time I came around. And my message is well, hold on a minute. This has been going on for hundreds of years, and we get to talk about it for 2 years, and then we have to shut up again? I don't think so. I got something to say, and I'm just going to have to say it however I can, right? So here I am, grassroots, trying to get the message out there. But it was important enough that I said, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do it on my own, and hopefully it'll go well, and lo and behold, it has. So, yeah. I actually had a really interesting situation. I spoke to Missouri twice this month. I've been doing a lot of talks this month, and a young Missouri librarian found my reel on Instagram and contacted me to talk to her community. And the basic message was that she lived in a very small town, and she really thought that it was, sort of a backwards attitude towards women and sexual assault and stuff. She really wanted me to speak to the women of her community. So I did a virtual talk 2 weeks in a row at 2 different branches there, and it was an incredible experience. At the end of the first talk, a woman in the audience basically confessed that she had been assaulted repeatedly for many, many years by her husband, and she had recently quit drinking, and she was basically saying, I haven't told any of you this before, but I basically feel like it's time. I want to share my story. And she put it out there. And then there was another woman in the audience who was like some sort of crisis counselor who had come to see the talk, and she was able to connect with the woman at the end. Afterwards, I heard about it and get her the help that she needed. But it was pretty incredible. So I felt like literally every time I do a talk, my attitude is if I communicate just to one person, if I help one person in the audience, then it was worth it. Just one. So, yeah. I don't know. It's just, it boils down to the fact that like the whole secrecy element is what is the most important thing we need to get rid of. And you know, it's tough because there's a lot of shame involved in it, but I don't have shame anymore, like obviously. I don't feel any shame about this. So practice, that's all it takes, right? Practice talking about it and it gets less shameful. And then hopefully, like, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking in terms of parallels to like me raising my son. And obviously I made mistakes with drinking, right? And quite frankly, I am so blatantly honest with my son. Both parents are sober, right? So that's not very good genetics. So we talk about that. And we just try to explain to him, you know, because of the mistakes that we made and the lessons that we learned, we share openly about that. And all we can do is hope that the lessons that we're giving him are going to help him along the way. Yeah, so if there's no other questions, I really appreciate all the support and thanks for coming.